I'm joined now by my guest, who is an economic analyst in the person of Aliyu Audu. Thank you for joining us on Business Daily this morning.
Thank you very much.
I will want to hear your opinions on, the rising inflation. And this is coming after we had seen a pause, or a slowdown, I should call it, 2 consecutive months of a slowdown in inflation rate. Speaking of the month of August and July, and now in the month of September, another rise to 32.70%. What are your thoughts on these numbers? As they say, data never really lies. So what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. One of the causes of food inflation, or inflation generally, is the devaluation of the naira, and also the increase in price of petrol, as you have said, which interrupts the food distribution. This makes the cost of transportation very high, and this leads to inflation. So this is what is driving inflation. In previous months, naira has been stable, and in the last month, naira has gone up, as you said, 1,700 to the dollar. And let's not forget, we have a lot of things we import. We import sugar, we import milk, we import meat, we import wheat, we even import fertilizer from Russia. So, and these are very unstable economies too. So this is what is causing inflation. Thank you.
You have identified some major areas which, in your opinion, would have contributed to the final numbers that we have seen come out from the National Bureau of Statistics. You did mention the hike in petrol prices. You did mention the cost of food, and also the naira devaluation and how the naira is faring in comparison with global currencies. But let's hear from you now, speaking specifically about the petrol price hike. We have seen petrol prices skyrocket in recent times. Right now, as I speak, a liter of petrol goes for above 1,000 naira, 1,100 in some places, 1,200 in some other places. But how would you say this directly impacted, the inflation numbers? Speaking of the petrol hike now.
Yeah, as you can see, transportation of goods and services is a key part of the economy, and you need petrol for that. So obviously, if the price of petrol goes up, I think it was about 2 months ago, it was about 700 naira, and it has moved to 1,100, and it's even increasing. So that is obviously going to translate on the cost of goods and services, because movement across Nigeria now is going to go up. Movement of food distribution now is going to go up, and that's going to directly impact the distribution of food, goods, and services. So automatically, if the price of petrol goes up, the price of transportation goes up, this is going to translate into the increment in prices of goods and services. If you're, for example, now you're traveling from Abuja to Lagos, and the price of petrol goes up, the cost of ticket is going to also go up. So this is the direct implication of increase in petrol prices on the price of goods and services. So that is why we are facing an increment in inflation, and this started from last year when the subsidy was removed. Thank you very much.
Well said there. Talking about supply chains being impacted, supply chains in the agricultural sector, moving food from the farm to the final consumer, and with the hike in petrol, that has obviously impacted on the final price that the consumer gets to buy these foods at. But we will still be looking at more as regarding the reports that we have seen from the NBS at the core inflation numbers, urban inflation, rural inflation, and food inflation again. So much more to come after the break. To stay, my guest, who is Aliyu Audu, an economic analyst, is still with me. We'll be back after the break. And you're still watching Business Daily, coming to you live on Trust TV. And Nigeria's persistent battle with inflation has reignited, as according to the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria's inflation rate hit 32.70% in the month of September, making a sharp reversal from the 2-month slowdown that had been witnessed before the month of September. But I still have my guest here with me. Before the break, we had started a conversation, breaking down the numbers. I still have Aliyu Audu, who is an economic analyst, right here with me on the program. Thank you again for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you.
Beyond reading out the numbers that we usually would get, I like for us to, explain what these numbers really does mean for the benefit of our viewers who are watching and wondering, what does inflation even mean? But what we do understand, at least, is the fact that Nigerians are experiencing, reduced purchasing power, seeing, essential goods like transportation and food becoming more expensive. But what can the government do in the short term to alleviate the pressures that Nigerians are going through at this moment?
Well, a very difficult one, because if you have been speaking for a very long time, the solution to this are long-term measures. But if the government must come in the short term, then a lot has to be done in terms of stabilizing the naira. And because you notice that in the previous 2 months, the dollar was stable and then inflation was stable. Immediately the dollar went up, inflation kicked in. Now let's go to the price of fuel. That has also greatly affected inflation. Now my suggestion is, let's make use of Dangote refinery. Let's try as much as possible to support, not for the sake of Dangote, but for the sake of Nigerians, to support Dangote in order for us to bring down the price of petrol. If we have to, supply him more crude, or whatever we have to do, or a direct relationship between Dangote and the marketer, cutting out the NNPC middleman, maybe that will reduce the price of petrol. So I think it has to be all hands on deck. We can't allow, Dangote and NNPC to keep arguing back and forth. There's a need for everybody to bring, especially the federal government, all hands on deck in order to, ensure that Dangote gets crude oil at a reduced cost so that he can pump it out at a cheaper cost for Nigerians. I think that is where those are the short-term measures that we can adopt for now. And let's also look at the agricultural sector. Perhaps we need to start investing more in agriculture, because if you notice that food inflation is primarily driven by agriculture and agricultural produce like sugar. We import sugar, wheat. There's a war in Ukraine now, and obviously if there's a war in Ukraine, there's going to be issues. Inflation is going to be there'll be inflation on their goods, and once it's imported into Nigeria, there's also going to be, the inflation is going to be brought back here. So the short-term measures, government has to come in with subsidies and try to do some sort of stabilization of the naira. But the long-term measures means we need to invest in agriculture a great deal. We should not be going back to importation of major commodities like sugar, milk, and other things that we can grow in Nigeria.
Well said. It is important that Nigeria, produces what we eat and eat what we produce. But you did mention, the need for subsidies. And I'm just wondering what area you are referring to, because in that regard, we have seen, quite a big spin done in recent times by the government, specifically in, the price of rice. We do understand that we have seen the federal government, that is the Ministry of Agriculture, now sell out bags of rice at subsidized rate of about 40,000 naira. Some Nigerians would say that's not enough. I mean, rice is not a problem. But how can the government, ease the current rising pressure that Nigerians are facing. We also have seen, what comes to mind also is the conditional cash transfer. But is that enough?
Well, it's not enough because it needs to go around people. For example, now, in the last couple of months, the level of poverty has increased from 88 million Nigerians to over 104 million Nigerians. So there's more people, going into poverty. Now, the government, not only the federal government, the state governments have to be hands-on too, meaning they have to be involved in the subsidize goods and services. In terms of housing, we should make housing more affordable because as prices are going up, rent is going up. So government can come in that way. Now, what government should normally do is in times of cheap agricultural produce, for example, there are seasons where tomato, corn, and a lot of major commodities are sold cheaply in the market because that is the season. Now, the Ministry of Agriculture should have silos in each state where they store these commodities, and at hard times like this they can provide food subsidies for Nigerians in terms of cheaper agricultural produce. There's nothing wrong with having food banks around. That's also a form of subsidy to alleviate poverty amongst the poor people. As you can see, the figure is increasing from 88 million Nigerians to 104 million Nigerians. Federal government and state government needs to be involved in providing this subsidy, and in terms of transportation also, there should be mass transit buses that their cost of transportation is greatly subsidized. We have not even looked at our rail system. We should develop our rail system, which is obviously a long-term objective. Rail is the cheapest means of transportation. If you go to most developed countries or even developing countries, they have an efficient rail system. So if rail is managed by the government and it reduces the cost of transportation, majority of people would use rail transportation. For example, now I think you can move from there's the Idu to Kubwa. If major flashpoints in Abuja, for example, Gariki, Kubwa, Nyanya, there's a light rail system that most people around, I think that would greatly reduce the cost of transportation and among states as well. So this is ways that, apart from mass transit buses, that is the short term. In the long term, we should look at enhancing or developing our rail system in order to reduce. All these factors help to reduce inflation. Now, without this, then you notice that any shock to the system, like increase in the dollar or increase in petrol prices, will now increase inflation. So these things need to be tamed. If we know that transportation is a major factor that leads to inflation, then we should always have ways of subsidizing transportation by providing mass transit buses, by the rail system, and what have you. So these are ways that government can alleviate in the short term, provide subsidy in the short term to alleviate inflation, especially storing food and redistributing food. Let's not also forget the Price Control Board. That in itself can help, because people take advantage, traders take advantage. You go to the market and the cost of tomato has gone up, and you ask, why is it high? And the trader will tell you the dollar is high. I mean, there's no correlation between dollar and tomato.
I mean, I've had my own fair share of that when I go to the market, maybe to buy vegetables, and you're told it has to do with the dollar too.
No, that is wrong. That is a misinterpretation of what is going on, because we grow our tomatoes. What has dollar got to do with tomatoes? There's no relationship. Do you understand? Especially now that so fuel has an impact, but dollar does not have an impact on what we produce locally, especially housing. We produce our cement here, We have our everything you need, blocks, Nigerian made. Agricultural, there should not be any relationship between food produced in Nigeria that we consume and dollar at all. So people take advantage of it, and that's why it's important to have price control boards to regulate and protect the consumer, which is majority of Nigerians.
Well said. But I'd like for us to also touch on the urban and rural inflation. I mean, usually you would have a wider gap between, inflationary pressures in the urban area compared to what is derived in the rural area. But this report, showed that that gap is, currently being breached, as urban inflation is standing at 2.67% and rural inflation, at 2.39%. That goes to show that reducing gap or disparity between urban and rural inflation. But what would you say is the major contributor to that reducing gap? I mean, usually you would find food at cheaper prices in rural areas, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that possibly there's a distribution. When you notice something is affecting prices of food in the rural areas, you'll suspect there's a shock in the distribution system, meaning that it could be as a result of security, because farmers cannot, go to their farms. I believe the level of security has reduced now. But then, if you also look at the cost of goods and of petrol also, it's even higher in the rural areas. In the town, petrol is probably 1,100, but when you go to the rural areas, the cost of petrol is high, and as such, the traders are going to translate this into the selling of their goods. There's no way they are going to be completely exonerated from that. So they would have to make their money back, and they will translate the increment in this price of petrol on their goods and services. And that's why you see the gap between rural inflation and urban inflation is closing, because petrol is sold higher in the rural areas, possibly for logistic reasons, than in urban areas. So that is the main concern, apart from security situation that we usually have in the rural areas, that farmers cannot go to their farms, especially in areas like Jos and Plateau. But that has reduced now. So I believe the major shock to, the major cause will be the increment in the price of petrol, especially in rural areas. Like in Kogi, for example, the inflation there is at 44%. Food inflation is much higher in Kogi State, or it is the highest in Kogi State in the whole of Nigeria than other parts of Nigeria. So this could be the reason accounting for it.
Well said. But let us look now at policy responses so far. We have seen, quite a lot come out, especially from the monetary side of government. Like I stated earlier, the CBN has, increased interest rate for about 4 consecutive times this year, simply to tackle inflation. But that hasn't yielded the results that the CBN has expected. It is yet to, stabilize the naira and manage inflation. But why would you say that is the case?
Well, the CBN is trying to stabilize inflation by rising interest rates 4 times. But CBN is not in control of the rise in petrol. So it cancels itself. When price of petrol is rising, interest rate is rising, people would rather focus on feeding themselves than, going to borrow money from the bank. That is one. So price of, because of the increase in price of petrol, that is going to lead to the increase in price of goods and services. So interest rate, the increment in interest rate, the effect will not be much, because majority of Nigerians, buy food. Majority of Nigerians are not going to the bank to borrow money for businesses at this time. So automatically, the increment in interest rate, the effect of that will be very much reduced, while what you'll see is a higher inflationary trend, because Every day you must eat. Every day you must transport yourself from one point to another, or farmers must move from one point of the, one part of the country to another. So the inflationary trend, or the inflation, will show its head more than interest rate. That's why you keep seeing price of goods and services. Inflation is going higher and higher, regardless of increase in interest rate, because people are trying to survive. If you look at it, nobody's trying to borrow money to go and do business. They're still trying to survive, and the price of basic commodities, petrol, food, is going up. Petrol is going up, so food automatically going up. So interest rate might not do anything at this stage.
But do you expect to see some form of stability, you know, impacted by the rise in interest rate? Currently it stands at 27.25%, maybe in the long term and not so much in the short term?
I expect to see a stability in the price of petrol. If the government should focus on stabilizing the price of petrol, because that's the major commodity that all other commodities depend on. Stabilization of the price of petrol. Petrol is like the motherboard that transportation uses, farmers uses, businessmen use. Moving from one point to another, you need petrol. You need to, our power supply is not very stable, so you need diesel also, or petrol, to run your generators. So if we want to stabilize the economy, we need to stabilize the price of petrol. First, interest rate is meant for a stable economy. We are not stable. Let's get that very correct. We are not stable yet. So why are you increasing interest rate when you're supposed to be focusing on stabilizing the price of petrol? Price of petrol, price of forex. Stabilize that, then you can talk about interest rate. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. You're just going to make it very difficult, because first of all, price of petrol is going up. People can eat. People cannot. Price of foods and services are going up, and then you are also increasing interest rate. Businessmen cannot borrow either, so you're sort of stifling the economy. So it's very important that the price of the major commodities is stabilized first, and when you achieve that stability, then you can now go into interest rate to make it a more stable economy. So,
but how would you gauge the government's efforts towards transiting, away from petrol? There has been a lot more done recently regarding CNG, that is compressed natural gas. We have also seen quite a number of people switch over, from using petrol to using gas, CNG. How would you gauge that? And do you believe that is the right economic policy in the right direction, that obviously should, have positive impact on inflationary pressures as well?
Yeah, a lot more has to be done. I'm not going to lie to you about that. We need to do a lot more. If we're transitioning from petrol to CNG to electric and all that, a lot of investment has to be put in that area, and we're not doing that, because we have to, first of all, sanitize people, create a sanitization, not just federal government, state governments too. You don't see a mass sanitization going on. You don't see a mass campaign of people to leave their cars and move to CNG. You don't see, partnerships between government and the private sector in providing cars, new cars, to a subsidized rate, to taxis, to people to go and buy, to civil servants. You don't see that. So if you really are serious about, moving from petrol to CNG and other areas, you have to invest heavily in it. No mixing words. It's garbage in, garbage out.
But in the defense of the government now, to mark, the Independence Day, we did see the subsidy, like you rightly mentioned, where people were allowed to switch over, from petrol to CNG for free. Wouldn't you say that is, some effort, at least, from the government?
Yeah, that is some effort. But don't forget, we're a population of over 200 million. We need to do more of it. The federal government is trying on its own, but the state government needs to be more involved. We're not seeing state government rolling out plans and saying, okay, this is what this are. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing a massive campaign by state governments. We're not seeing that. Let's the truth be told. And you find out that majority of Nigerians are in the rural areas. Majority of the Nigerians are in states. So the state governments need to get involved and, carry out mass campaign like the federal government is doing. The federal government is trying, but more needs to be done because we're a growing population, and you need to send the message around the whole of Nigeria, especially a place like Lagos that you see that there's a lot of mulwe, there's a lot of mass transit buses. That needs to be offered to, the commercial drivers there. And real efforts with real cars on the ground. Somebody that is struggling to feed is not going to think about CNG. Let's be frank. You understand? So they need to say, okay, come here, give us your old car, we'll give you a new car, and then you pay over a period of time, and then we'll give you CNG. You don't expect a man struggling to bring his mulwe to you and be talking about CNG. He probably wouldn't do that.
Yeah, well explained. But before we go, I would like to hear your outlook for the remaining months of the year. We still have the months of October, November, and December. This is the last quarter where we will be getting inflation reports, from the NBS regarding those months. What is your outlook as the year winds up? Do you expect to see an increase or a decrease now?
Yeah, my outlook is we need to stabilize petrol first. Whatever is going on between Dangote, NNPC, and marketers needs to be resolved. The government needs to come out and tell us this is the price of petrol, and it stops there. If there's an increment of 10 naira, 20 naira, that's fine, but we need to know what is the benchmark price for petrol so that we don't wake up to shocks and surprises. Shocks and surprises are not good. It creates instability, and with instability, that's not what we're looking for right now. So if we are able to stabilize the price of petrol, then I believe there's a stable outlook going forward. That is what I expect from the federal government. And if that is achieved, then we can have a more positive outlook into the future. Even though the reforms currently taking place, subsidy removal and what have you, is not a short-term, you're not going to get short-term results. It's something that we'll see the benefit in some years coming. So in the short term, we should focus on stabilizing the price of petrol. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have been speaking with Aliyu Audu, who is an economic analyst, speaking to the recent inflation data released by the National Bureau of Statistics, saying that inflation did rise to 32.70% in the month of September. Thank you very much for all the insights you've shared with us on today's edition of the program.
Thank you very much.
And that's the much that we can take today, but keep the conversation going across all our social media platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, and of course on X, and we'll be there to interact with you. My name is Chiamaka Enendu. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.